The organizations I work with, our goal is to have between 5 to 10% of the meeting attendees trained as allies, and they receive typically a ribbon for their badge. And so, people see the ribbons and they know who the allies are, and it's often a conversation starter. It's like, oh, what's an ally? How does that work?
Welcome to the Convene podcast. My name is Maggie, Digital Media Editor at Convene. Today I'm joined by Senior Editor Jane Dienst, and we have a guest, Paula Brantner, an employment lawyer turned consultant on harassment prevention in workplaces. Jane interviewed Paula about a year ago for an article on toxic behavior at events. We recently recorded a Convene talk where we discussed new instances of violence at off-site events. And together with Jen, we thought that it would be a great idea to touch base once again with Paula on the topic. Paula, Jen, it's a pleasure to have you both here. Paula, what responsibility does an event planner bear when it comes to non-sanctioned events taking place over the course of their conference or convention?
Well, while there may not be legal responsibility, and as you mentioned, I am a lawyer, but I'm not giving legal advice here. Even though there may not be legal responsibility, if something happens to your attendees at an event that's sponsored by your vendors or other participants in the conference, and the reason it exists is because of your conference being held in a particular city, then you need to be prepared if something happens. And you should have a code of conduct that's broad enough to cover the situation, even though it's beyond the site location itself.
So, just to kind of recap a little bit, this is an interesting topic because when I interviewed you last year, we talked about a lot of things, specifically setting up allyship programs on
hmm
site at events. And this kind of stemmed because we had read about a few examples of off-site harassment happening. One was at the Game Developers Conference, and another was at a Bitcoin conference in Miami. And then at those events, there were two completely separate events, and one woman reported getting roofied at a networking event held off-site. At another, on the Bitcoin conference, there were multiple reports of all types of inappropriate behavior. And I think we see this again and again in headlines. This kind of stems because we read about a story in NPR at, I believe it was another tech conference. So again, these kind of male-dominated spaces or just spaces where there isn't a lot of gender diversity or diversity in general, and we kind of see this behavior happening again and again. I actually saw a Twitter thread the other day, and I'm blanking on the industry and the name of the conference, but it was the same old story, tale as old as time, where inappropriate behavior was happening. So and we noticed a lot of questions coming from planners like, oh, well, we know what our responsibility is on site, but when something happens at an off-site event, say at a bar where it's a completely non-sanctioned event, then the waters get kind of murky because obviously you want your attendees to feel safe wherever they are, especially because a destination comes, so often it's not just the venue, it's the entire destination that's serving as a venue for the event. So it seems like there's a little bit of a gray area here, and what, like you're saying, while there's no legal responsibility necessarily, but are there things that planners can do, in your opinion, that maybe would just help them feel safer when they're out and about at bars or restaurants, wherever it is, these unofficial spaces where things like this tend to happen because it's off hours?
hmm Yeah, so I think there are some things that planners can do to prepare. You never think it will happen to you until it does. And so often time is of the essence in terms of a rapidly unfolding situation on site. And so some of the things you can do in advance is, obviously have a code of conduct, have a way that people can report what happens to you so that you're aware of the situation as soon as possible. That you don't have to read about it on Twitter, that, people are coming to you and saying, this thing happened between, someone attending the conference and one or multiple attendees. And then your first priority is to make sure that anyone this happened to is okay, and that, whatever support and advice they need, is a top priority. And that's something that allies can help with because they're trained in bystander intervention. And sometimes if they're at the incident, they may play a role in keeping it from escalating. But even after something happens, they can be a supportive listener for someone who is very traumatized by something that happened to them. So I think having that allies program, sometimes it's hard as a meeting planner to kind of drop everything and focus on the situation. But if there are a number of allies who can also play that supportive role, that gives, the meeting planner just that much more support and is able to provide that assistance to anyone who's been targeted for something like this happening.
Do you think it creates more of an awareness? Like, I'm wondering if, in your experience, you've seen, especially in these spaces that are a little bit more male dominated, if they've never had anything like that before, and then you develop a program like an allyship program or, just something that is communicated to the attendees that, hey, like we're watching out for this. There's a system for this now. Do you think that creates a sense of awareness where people maybe internally who, oh, like, okay, like this is happening. Like, I'm curious to know if you think there's like something psychologically that shifts.
Yeah, I think so. The organizations I work with, our goal is to have between 5 to 10% of the meeting attendees trained as allies, and they receive typically a ribbon for their badge. And so, people see the ribbons and they know who the allies are, and it's often a conversation starter. It's like, oh, what's an ally? How does that work? And so people are more aware that there is a code of conduct, that there is a reporting process, and there are people trained in bystander intervention and active listening who are there to both support someone if something happens, but also to be the eyes and ears of the meeting planners throughout the conference. And, one of the groups I worked with, the first year there was a lot of interest. There was probably 5% of the people involved. And now we're over 10% because every year new people say, wow, that's great. I want to be involved in this. And, not everyone who's trained can attend every year. So we want to constantly be adding. But I think having that many people that visible to attendees can both, discourage people from doing some of the things that they might otherwise do, knowing that they're being watched, but also that the allies can often diffuse a situation and prevent it from escalating, prevent it from affecting, more than one individual if they can kind of step in and intervene. So I definitely think it plays an important role both in terms of monitoring and awareness and also in terms of prevention and stopping escalation.
What do you think is the right way to investigate such an incident when it occurs? So how can event planners know where to begin?
I have received investigator training and, work with a lot of organizations where I'm the person on site because I think event planners may not feel like they have the either the tools to investigate or the expertise or the bandwidth while they're managing so many other things at a conference. But I think just some tips if they don't have someone like me present to do that, first go to the person who was harmed, whether they've reported it through your reporting system, or you've been made aware that something has happened to this person, you start with them, you talk with them while they remember as much as they can about the incident. And it's important to find out what other witnesses were there because you may have a chance to talk to them while they're still on site. And if the situation was not directed at them personally, they were just a witness, they may be able to fill in some gaps that the person targeted may not remember or be aware of because, they're dealing with this bad thing happening to them. So they may not be focused on all of the other details like witnesses would be. So the first thing is to kind of find out everyone who was there and, talk to them and find out what they recall about what happened. Because armed with that, then when you talk to the accused, you can see, does the story match up? Are they saying something completely different happened than what, multiple witnesses are saying, which is a common response. You don't want to take responsibility. You don't want to be held accountable. So they may have seen the situation completely differently. So you just, try to talk to everybody you can as quickly as you can. And sometimes people don't want to talk while they're at the conference. They just want to get through the rest of the meeting and wait until they're home to, be involved in a situation like this. So you have to respect that, of course, but you do your best to at least identify who you would want to talk to later.
And I'm thinking, have you seen cases where you had to, for example, call law enforcement in such serious cases?
Luckily, I have not personally encountered that, but I think it's something that meeting planners need to be prepared to do. First, event security, hotel or conference center. You're probably already working with security for the facility. And so you may need to involve them if you need to, for example, eject someone from the meeting. And hopefully you will not need law enforcement. But if you do, you should work with your venue security to figure out, how to involve them. One important thing I think I'd like to emphasize is that if it's a situation that you would consider involving law enforcement, and I think that's probably like physical assault or sexual assault, you need to defer to what the person who was harmed wants and don't contact law enforcement without their knowledge and consent. And so some may sort of feel like, oh, well, a crime happened, we need to contact the police. But, people have different experiences and past trauma from law enforcement. And, particularly in the area of sexual assault, that may not be something that they want to do or prepared to do on site. And so, have the number handy of the local rape crisis center and their national numbers so that if something like this happens on site, you make them a priority, make sure that they get the counseling and support that they need from a trained professional.
Jen, everything started with your article, and it was the first time that I actually learned about allyship programs. And we were discussing with you also if that's something that very US based. So I don't know if you've researched it, and I'm sure that Paula, you can tell us if you've actually worked on such programs outside the US, or if you know of such.
So some of the organizations I work with are international organizations. And so they have meetings around the world every year, picking a different location. Sometimes it's cost prohibitive to have me on site for all of those meetings. So what I typically do if I'm not able to travel internationally to a conference or that's not in their budget is that I am available virtually. And so we train the allies in advance of the meeting, sometimes, like a month or, sometime in advance. And then, when they're on site, they receive the ribbons, they're, connected with the meeting planner. And then I field reports from someone who, something happens and they want to report it. I set up different reporting channels via phone, via text, via email, or a reporting form where they fill out kind of all the information that we would need for an investigation. And so sometimes I hear directly from someone that something has happened to, and sometimes the event planner or the allies, talk to someone and encourage someone to report to me, or they're in the process of handling the situation on site, so that we work together to figure out the best approach for next steps, whether it's, how we can provide support, how we can address the conduct of the accused, and then how we generally want to proceed, whether there needs to be a greater investigation that takes place after the meeting.
Have you ever had to deal with this in a location outside of the US, like while you were on site? And did it completely change how you handled it?
I think there are some differences internationally in that you're working with local organizers, and, there may be language differences or barriers. But I think in some ways the approach is the same, which is, identify the person who was harmed, provide whatever support they need. And that may be local, and, you may have to do more work in advance preparing for, local support networks, that sort of thing. But you just want to make sure they have support. You want to make sure that you address the accused behavior if you
Mhm.
believe it will cause harm to your meeting attendees. And then you need to decide, what happens after the conference and whether there are consequences for the person's behavior. And, rarely will something be so serious that you would need to eject someone on site, but you may, following an investigation, want to ban them from participation in future meetings, or eject them from the organization itself.
And can you add, I should have asked this earlier, but give us an idea of the types of groups that you most commonly work with? I think when I interviewed you before, you had told me mostly like science, academic, but has that changed? What does the scope of work look like there?
Yeah, yeah. So back in the beginning of 2023, I got into this work via colleague Sherry Martz, who had really pioneered this work of ally programs and working on site for meeting safety. And then, everybody canceled their meetings because of the pandemic. And she had to sort of pivot to virtual meeting safety. And, sadly, we found that harassers are going to harass, and there was still, even though there was not physical interaction, there were still things that groups had to deal with. But after all of that, she decided she was ready to retire. And so I took over the business. And, she came from kind of a STEM background, an academic background. And so that was kind of who most of her clients are. And I'm happy to say that, I've continued with most of the people that she worked with. And then I say I have picked up a few, kind of just spreading out from there. I work with several professional associations that are not limited to academics. And just, every profession has it, membership, advocacy, trade association group. And so I work with a few of those. And I did work, and I still do a little work with open source organizations and communities. They're a little different than membership organizations, but, work with an open source software community. And I'm now working with an open source community that is working on industry standards for genetic data. And so, that's more.
What does open source mean? Sorry, I don't know.
It's just the data, the information is not held by a private entity, but is something developed by a community. So if it's software, you have a community of developers working on it, and it's not like, a company like Microsoft or Google owning it. It's collectively owned by the community.
Okay. I
And
think I've heard of that before. Okay.
so, that work is more year round. It's not just limited to meetings, but it's constant interactions between working groups collaborating on a particular project, or they have discussion forums and need online management of conduct and, working with moderators and, harassment using, forums and things like that. So most of the groups, I'm trying to work with them to move beyond meetings to conduct in the industry that potentially affects meetings and affects the organization negatively, potentially. But, honestly, we've developed something. I had a client, wrapped up my engagement recently, but they were a nationwide political organization that had chapters and interaction amongst members, both in these chapters around the country and online. So, the model that we've developed can work in virtually any industry or meeting setting.
How is this working with, in the field of politics, especially right now in the US?
Well, it's, obviously it's a lot. It's hard to address, and I think groups come together over shared values. And that happens in politics. You gravitate towards people who share their values. And so in, the organization I worked with, there was a common set of values that attracted people to the organization. But you also have the challenges of people being in different places, in working with other people, collaborating with other people, their history of managing and addressing conflict and what to do when there's conflict. And, we spend a lot of time working with the organization, enforcing their code of conduct and having a process when someone's conduct harmed another person, and sort of a way of dealing with that to hold people accountable for the conduct. But we also spend a lot of time managing conflict generally to prevent things from escalating. And particularly in smaller chapters, small groups of people, the conflict can really take over and make it hard to do the things that you've come together to accomplish. And so we worked with groups to manage the conflict so that they could get back to doing the things that were important to them. And I think that's important in any organization. You think about a meeting, the meeting planner just wants to get through the meeting and have a successful meeting that people come back to every year. And so there's a need to manage whatever conflict that arises and have a way to address anything that violates their code of conduct.
So, are you seeing essentially like bad behavior stemming from just differences in political ideologies, and like if that's it, what kind of bad behavior? And are you seeing like 'cause I'm curious because this is something that we're talking about as we get closer to the election. Things are getting more and more polarized, and I'm scared to kind of think about what's going to happen in November, whoever wins. We know just from what, recent past events, like, things can get out of control really, really quickly. So I'm curious to know, like, are you seeing trends of certain types of behavior? What are you seeing?
One of the things that obviously is an area of conflict for people right now is the Middle East and Israel
Mm,
and Palestine. And, we have had that spillover into meetings where, people have very strongly held opinions, regardless of, which side of the situation you support. And how do you manage that conflict in a meeting setting? And we recently had it come up where a person in their slide presentation, their PowerPoint had a slide that said Free Palestine. It was on their opening slide that was up, before their presentation started. So people are coming in to see the presentation and they see that and they're offended and uncomfortable. And so they reported that this happened. And the person who put it on their slide said, well, science is political, and there are a lot of things that you can post about that could offend certain attendees, or you look at like LGBTQ issues or climate change issues, or there's a lot of things that there's contention about, and people have different political views, religious views. And so how can you manage that in a meeting setting and, draw some of those lines where you say, we're not trying to restrict what you say or what you present, but you also need to be mindful of what attendees feel about the situation and recognize that there may be conflict around some of the things that you say.
Sounds really challenging. It sounds like there's like a really big gray area there, like you said, because you can't necessarily tell someone to keep their mouth shut and infringe on their freedom of speech. It seems like it would be a little bit of a murkier issue than, say, sexual harassment, because there really are fine lines there, Interesting.
Yeah, and I think groups feel differently about where that line is drawn. We respond to whatever reports we receive. So if an attendee reports something, we commit to them that we're going to address it. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that it rises to the level of harassment or assault or some of the other kind of big issues that we address. So in this situation, we talk to people on both sides and had a sense of it was just like a one slide thing that we know happened. There wasn't really an investigation as to whether this happened. It was more, okay, how is the organization going to respond? And so, we talked to the person whose slide it was on, and we heard their views about why they felt it was important to include this. And we're also taking a look at in the future what the guidelines for speakers will entail, and if there's any changes that we need to do to that to let speakers know, okay, this is where we're going to draw the line. And we ask that in your presentation that you focus on particular things and not focus on other things because of the conflict they may present.
That's interesting. I feel like that could be another story. Our cover story last issue is all about coaching speakers and how to work with speakers. And I feel like as we get closer to the election, a lot of our coverage will kind of touch on what you're talking about. So we may have to revisit that topic for another story.
Yeah, well, it's really evolving with each meeting because, again, it comes back to those shared values. And there are some conferences where that no one would blink an eye at that. It's like, oh, okay, that's where they stand on this issue. But, others felt it was not germane to a scientific presentation and it was political and therefore inappropriate. And so, it really varies. I worked with an organization last year that shared conference space, and this organization was very pro LGBTQ. People wore rainbow clothing. There were some affinity groups at the meeting, and they were sharing space with an evangelical religious organization.
Remember you telling me about this.
Yeah. And that organization had, those like photo backdrops where you go and stand by the backdrop and take your picture. There's like a photo booth. And then, so they had an anti-trans hashtag. And so, there were people who didn't feel safe in the space. They were having confrontations in the restroom and some of the commonly shared spaces. And, someone used an anti-gay slur. So we had to get the venue staff involved. And ultimately, the space was shared. There wasn't much they can do, but on the meeting planner's side, this group wants to make sure in the future that they know what other groups are sharing the space. And they can't prevent the convention center from, making their space available. But the convention center also wanted to document all the specific incidents so that if this group wanted to rent space again, hold their meeting in this facility again, they could say, no, you violated our code of conduct the last time, you're not welcome back.
Could they put something in their contracts, like a frustration of purpose clause or something like that when they're signing with future venues? Or what would be the way if a group has that concern that they could kind of get ahead of that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not involved with that side, so I'm sure there are things that they're doing that I'm not aware of, but I know that they, committed into the future to have those conversations with the venue, the convention center, particularly if it's a large shared space, like,
Hmm.
convention centers tend to be, to be aware up front. And again, make sure that if they anticipate problems, to work very closely with the facility staff. And I
Yeah.
think if they're choosing between venues, that they might make a decision based on who they would be sharing the space with. If they exclusively, like if it's a hotel convention center and they have, the run of the house, so they don't have to worry about it versus they're in a space where they would have to share the space and wonder whether or not the other group is compatible, that would go into their planning decisions. Although a lot of groups, as you know, plan several years in advance. And so, you
Yeah.
may have that challenge of not knowing. And the irony with this particular client is that they had moved their meeting out of a state due to the passage of laws perceived that it would be hostile and their attendees would not feel safe. So it's like, okay, we're not going to meet in this state. We're going to move to this other location, which was a very, progressive city. But yet this thing happened
Yeah.
in this progressive city.
That's something I just finished writing a story about. I
Mhm.
interviewed the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, and she said that the number of places that they can meet has dwindled down to, I mean, like, I think she said less than a dozen states. And then when you put their space requirements on top of that, it's even less because these are physicians who deal with high risk pregnancies, also researchers, and
Mhm.
they had to move their meeting out of Texas at the last minute after SB2 was passed because not only was, that law just not friendly to the work that they do, but it literally would have allowed people to, prosecute them because of that law if they had met there because
Right.
they're
They're
actually doing
talking
their
about those strategies.
yeah, and they're actually doing trainings on site,
Mhm.
abortion
Mhm.
related trainings. So but what they ended up doing, which the story kind of dives into, is we've changed the language in our contracts and basically allows it to, forgive me for not knowing the proper legal terms, I'm blanking, but the frustration of purpose clause, where if I believe it says the state or the law and maybe even the venue would have to double check if something happens that would infringe on, the ability of them to convene safely, then they can switch and get out of the
Mhm.
contract. So I
Right.
feel like I'm hearing more examples of that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's definitely something that planners are keeping in mind. And, again, didn't anticipate this particular incident, but now it's something that people are taking into account. Just so, obviously the primary priority is making sure the attendees feel safe and that, like you said, there's a particular reason why people are convening there and knowledge that is to be shared. And if you cannot do that freely without, worrying
Hmm.
about the safety of your attendees or worrying about restricting their speech, that people are there to hear and to learn from, then you really just can't meet in that space. And I also work with groups, coming from my background as an employment lawyer and working with labor groups that, if there's a strike or a boycott of the hotel, or the hotel has been engaged in union busting, there's also a list of union hotels that people can choose from if that is an important value of their organization, which it is for some organizations I'm affiliated with. So every
Interesting.
group has to kind of define its priorities and its values when looking for space and making sure that, the people that come to the meeting are not going to be at odds with the particular location where the meeting takes place.
Yeah, it's really not just space and rates anymore. I mean, there's so
Mhm.
much that goes into it now, or that needs to go
Yeah.
into it now. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. And if you don't do that, then your attendees are like, "Why didn't you think about this? Like, why didn't you, try to do something?" And like for example, my clients last year, because they moved from the one space, they had to go with what they could get at the last minute. And so, their options were limited even further. So if you don't think about it way in advance, or obviously some developments you can't anticipate, then you may be kind of stuck at the last minute, scrambling for something that meets your needs.
That's tough.
I want to bring you back a bit to the code of conduct because you mentioned it at the very start. But to be honest, as an event attendee, I don't remember ever actually reading the code
Mhm.
of conduct that the organizers posted. So, do you have any tips to make those code of conducts really reach the eyes of those potential attendees? I don't know if there anything maybe when they register, so they can really acknowledge reading the file, or I don't know what suggestions do you have there?
Yeah, I work with organizations to figure out every single thing that we might possibly do to make this visible. And it starts with the registration, where you have to check a box that you've read the code of conduct and agree to the code of conduct. Now, we check those boxes all the time and don't necessarily do that, but, we invite them to do that and make clear that whether or not they read it, they're accountable to it if they're attending this meeting. So it starts there, including it in the conference website. If the conference is using a mobile app, putting it in the mobile app. And we often use QR codes for both the code of conduct itself and the reporting form. And, one interesting thing that I didn't even think about, it kind of worked out this way, but in the mobile app for the meeting, code of conduct was at the very top, and right underneath it was Wi-Fi. So everyone was going to be going to the Wi-Fi tab. And so the code of conduct is like right there next to the Wi-Fi. And so it ended up making it very visible and something that a lot of attendees were likely to see because, it was next to the Wi-Fi. Slides at the opening plenary, with featuring the QR codes, featuring the code of conduct, often the president or executive director of the organization will start the opening plenary with like housekeeping items. And so like they mention it. Sometimes I'm in the room and am introduced to the attendees as someone who's here, if something happens that they can report to me. So kind of making my work visible in the meeting. We do signage, a big foam core sign right next to the registration desk that says, all attendees are subject to the code of conduct, and, here's the QR code for both the code and the reporting form. We sometimes have those signs at events with alcohol, where, trying to strategically figure out where people might need to see them, which often includes like the exhibit hall, poster session near where the alcohol is being served. And We have, a lot of different ways to kind of get that information out there. And, in advance of the meeting, now that I work with clients kind of year round, well in advance of the meeting, while the planners are thinking of all the slides and all the swag and all the things that you plan in advance. The app, I just worked with someone, realized it said 2023, and it's like, oh, we need to update the year and a new reporting form and make sure all of that stuff is current now that people are starting to register for the meeting. So, you just try to think of all the different ways that people might learn about the information. I have one client that sends out a daily newsletter to attendees. It's like the highlights of the day. Here's the plenary session. Here's, some, the reception, the kind of the big events that attendees might want to know about. But on, the bottom of all that, they have every day, they have the code of conduct and a link to me and the reporting. So, just whatever ways that you communicate with your attendees and remind them, thinking about, how to do that strategically. And I think, and having the allies walk around with their ribbons and they know all of this. And so their visibility contributes as well, because like I say, it can be a conversation starter. Everyone likes, all the ribbons on their badge, representing different things. And I was just at a conference, had like fun ribbons, it was like not just like they're a board member or they're a speaker, but, just kind of random things. But the allies ribbon can be a conversation starter and kind of create that awareness as well. If people don't know, there's a code of conduct and there's someone in that allies role.
I like the fact that you mentioned combining the two. So the code of conduct plus the reporting, just to make it visible and for people to be aware that here's a quick way to report if there is an incident, which I find very good because I have not seen it. I think we need to see it.
Yeah. Well, happy to work with organizations to create that visibility. And, I had an incident last year and we started talking about offsite events. And this was an offsite event. A vendor was sponsoring a party. And, people went to it thinking it would be a networking opportunity. And the host of the party, who was the sponsor of the conference, was passing out shots to undergrad students who may not be legal drinking age.
Oh, they weren't even legal. Wow.
Well, I don't know, because they were just passing out the shots. They weren't going to the bar and, having the bartender check ID or, have a wristband or anything like that. So, in a lot of events, they have drink tickets and you get 2 drink tickets, and that helps moderate the alcohol consumption. But this event, they were passing out shots, and the host of the event became very intoxicated, and someone was reporting to me as the situation was unfolded. Like, I got an eyewitness account. The host of this event is being inappropriate with young women. And then another attendee, they didn't have an allies program, but another attendee saw this young woman mouthing over his shoulder, "Help me." And so he came over and, kind of pulled the guy away to ask him a question. And someone was standing next to her, heard a very crude sexual proposition. And so he witnessed that. And then there was the target, the victim. And so I had 4 perspectives of the same situation from different vantage points, and they all validated each other in terms of this happening. And then when we confronted the accused of this behavior, he said, "Well, I was drunk, but I didn't do anything inappropriate." And it's like, "Well, yes, you did." And so he has been banned from the meeting for, I think, 3 years was what the organization decided, that he would not be allowed to attend the meeting. And his organization, who sponsored the party, was informed that, passing out shots and, this kind of environment at their parties was not acceptable. And if something happened at a future event, that they would not be allowed to, sponsor the conference and, do anything like that in the future. But word is that they were very embarrassed and, we're very committed to not having anything escalate out of control like that in the future.
Yeah, well, really good that you were there and that they had the program in place, because I don't know, Jen, about you, but I feel like I've been in such situations, but I've never had the ways to report or even the awareness of like that I had to report such instances. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, some groups have had it in place for a little while and kind of it's part of the common values of the organization. And so everybody knows if something, bad happens or potential violation that they should report and that there's someone to go to. And then other organizations, it's brand new. And we're just trying to create that awareness. And, sometimes early on, it's hard to see whether nothing is really happening and they have a good positive environment or whether people are just getting used to the idea that they can come forward and safely report these things. And another thing that we really try to emphasize with folks is I am external to the organization and I do not have these pre-existing professional and personal relationships. And so if they want to come to me, I can share the information anonymously. And so they don't have to come forward and risk their career on, oh, we know that this person reported. I can manage the situation and the investigation such that, their name does not have to be associated with it, and the decision makers within the organization don't have to know who reported. And sometimes I even take things like the gender out of it because, I don't want gender values to and biases to impact how people respond to it. So, I take out any identifying information if I can that would potentially jeopardize the person's identity or lead to some form of retaliation.
So just wrapping up, was there anything we didn't mention we definitely should address before closing?
I'm looking at your questions and trying to think if there's anything. It seems like we talked about a lot of things. Is there anything else you want to ask me about that you feel like we, follow up on something we talked about previously or, just kind of fill in any gaps?
I feel like this was great. We went down some really good rabbit holes. I think that I didn't even think of, with the political stuff and the speakers, which we'll definitely have to come back to. I feel like this is just an ever evolving topic because awareness is changing, like society's always changing. And it's great to see something like this in place because, I remember when I was like 20 years ago when I started out my career, there were so many things that happened that if I dealt with now, like I would completely change how I dealt with that. But because I was young and because things were very different in 2000 and when did I graduate? 2006. So, things were it was a very different atmosphere then. And I feel like young people coming up in their careers now know because there's awareness, like what's right and what's wrong, because it's really hard to have a sense of that
Mm-hmm.
when you're that young,
Yeah.
So I love that programs like this are in place just to raise that level of awareness.
Yeah, I think, one of the things we're seeing and, in the clients that I work with, we always have to keep in mind is the power disparity. That there are senior people who can literally make or break your academic career, and their behavior has caused people to leave the field entirely. Some of these incidents completely affect the trajectory of someone's career and someone's life. And so if we can interrupt that, prevent that level of, harm happening so that people feel safe, people feel welcomed in the particular profession or field that they have chosen to be part of. Dealing with some of these incidents quickly, promptly, and holding people accountable can change the trajectory of someone's life. And I always try to keep that in mind when I'm talking to people that, that's really important.
Well, thank you for your work. You're doing really important work.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. I feel very lucky to be part of this and to be, trying to bring about some important and much needed change in these environments and these industries and professions. And thank you for making people aware of this, because I think, it's just something that is very important to your meeting planners.
I
Yeah,
think so too. Yeah.
I do believe it should be a standard.
I
Yeah,
work
go
with
ahead.
these scientific organizations, and the NSF, National Science Foundation, has made it a requirement if they contribute funds to an academic conference that the organization has a code of conduct and a reporting mechanism. And so this is now a requirement. And I'm working with a client now who's an NSF awardee. And so they're carving out the funds to make my services available because it's required. And so that's a really important, some of the governing bodies making this a standard for groups that they sponsor or fund. I think that's really going to make a difference.
That's awesome. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was really excited when I saw that, and not just for, business reasons, but it's like, okay, this is just going to become, it's not a luxury. It's not something you kind of add on to the budget after everything else. It's a standard. It's a baseline that you must have, and you must think about how you're going to do this and allocate the funds to do this.
I love that. It's really good. It's a good change.
Yeah, yeah. It's slow and it's long overdue, but I do believe it's happening.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you, for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, do give us a 5-star review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more industry insights, visit pcma.org/convene. Until next time.